On a September morning in 2006, in a conference room in Dearborn, Michigan, a man signed his own family's name to the single riskiest piece of paper in the history of the American automobile industry. The document put up as collateral nearly everything his company owned: the factories, the patents, the headquarters tower, even the blue oval on the hood of every car the company had ever sold. The logo itself was pledged against the loan, $23.6 billion. The largest corporate financing in American industrial history, borrowed not to expand the company, but to keep it from dying. If the loan went bad, the bank would not just own a car company, it would own the name. Here is what makes that morning strange. This was not a family watching a fortune drain away through inheritance and mansions, the way it had for the Vanderbilts, or the Posts, or the Bushes of Budweiser. This was a family that had done almost everything right. A family that, alone among every dynasty in this story, still controlled the company that carried its name. 5 generations after a mechanic from Michigan built his first working engine on a workbench behind his house. And in that room, they were betting all of it, the name and the vote and the empire, on a single loan, because for 100 years this family had built something none of the others ever managed: a firewall. A structure that kept the vote in the family long after the money and the daily power inside the company had already begun to slip away. So how does the one dynasty that solved the puzzle every other family in this series failed to solve end up mortgaging its own name just to survive? The easy explanation is the one you already believe. A recession hit, gas prices spiked, the company made bad cars for a decade, and the family paid for it like anyone else would. All of that is true, and none of it is the real story. The real story starts 30 years earlier than this conference room, and it starts with a decision that had nothing to do with cars at all. It started with a death, a tax bill, and a piece of paper almost nobody outside the family ever saw. To understand what they were protecting in 2006, you have to go back to the machine itself, because nobody handed this family a company. The founder was a farm boy with no patience for farming, obsessed instead with anything that had gears in it. He worked as an engineer for an electric company by day and tinkered with a gasoline engine in a shed by night. And in 1903, with a group of investors and $28,000 in starting capital, he put his name on a car company. The first years were unremarkable. What made the company was not the car, it was the method. In 1908, he introduced a simple, reliable, inexpensive automobile, and 5 years later he did something that changed the shape of American industry itself. He put the car on a moving line and had the workers stand still while the work came to them. A car that once took half a day to assemble now rolled off the line in about 90 minutes. Then he did something his fellow industrialists thought was insane. He doubled the average factory wage overnight to $5 a day, not out of charity, but out of arithmetic. A worker who could afford to buy the very car he was building would keep buying it and would stop quitting after 6 exhausting months on the line. It worked. By the mid-1920s, the company built more than half of every car sold in the entire world. This was the machine. Not a railroad choke point, not a national grocery brand, but a method, a way of making things fast and cheap and endlessly repeatable. And the man who owned it owned something that printed money every single day the line kept moving. And here is where this family's story splits from every other one in this series. In 1916, a pair of minority shareholders sued the founder, arguing he was withholding profits from them to reinvest in expansion instead of paying dividends. He lost that lawsuit. And rather than accept a company where outside shareholders could outvote him on how his own machine should be run, he did something almost nobody in his position ever chooses to do. He bought them all out. In 1919, he paid roughly $105 million to acquire every share of stock he did not already own, and made the company entirely private again, entirely his family's, with not one outside vote left in the room. Where the Vanderbilts sold shares to grow, and the Bushes sold shares for 100 years without ever noticing the ownership slipping away, this founder went the opposite direction the very first time a stranger tried to tell him what to do with his machine. Total, absolute, private control. It was the single most important decision in the family's entire history, and it would keep the company out of public hands for the next 37 years. For a while, it looked like the fragmentation that killed every other dynasty in this story simply could not happen here. There was no scattering of shares to cousins, no outside board to answer to, just one family, one machine, one vote. But control this total creates its own kind of danger because it all runs through the health and the mortality of one bloodline. The founder's only son, a quieter and more diplomatic man than his father, ran the daily business for 2 decades and was being groomed to eventually take full command. Then, in 1943, in the middle of a war that had turned every factory in the company over to building tanks and bombers instead of cars, the son died suddenly, still in his 40s. The founder, now nearly 80 and increasingly unwell himself, was forced back into the chief executive's chair he had meant to hand off years earlier, and the family now faced the exact danger every dynasty in this universe eventually faces: succession, with no clean plan in place, and a war-strained company that needed a steady hand it did not have. The founder held on for 4 more difficult years. When he finally died in 1947, the family's crisis was not really about who would run the company, it was about a tax bill. Under the estate tax laws of the era, passing down a private company worth an enormous sum, on paper, meant the family would owe the government a bill so large that paying it in cash would have forced them to sell a controlling stake of the company to outsiders just to cover it. This is the exact trap that had already devoured other fortunes in this series. The moment a family's wealth becomes a number on a page that the government wants paid in real money the family does not have sitting in a checking account. For nearly every dynasty in history, this is the beginning of the end. The heirs sell shares to raise cash, the shares end up in strangers' hands, and the voting power that once belonged entirely to the family starts leaking out, one estate settlement at a time. Here is the move that makes this family's story different from every other one in this universe. Years before the founder's death, on his own initiative, he and his son had quietly created a private charitable foundation, ostensibly for research and education, but structured with a second purpose almost nobody outside the family's lawyers understood at the time. When the estate was finally settled, the family split the company's stock into 2 separate classes. One class, representing the overwhelming majority of the company's economic value, roughly 95% of it, was donated to that foundation. Because it was a charitable gift, it was not taxed the way a direct inheritance would have been. The other class, a small sliver of the company's total economic value, carried almost all of the voting power and stayed in the family's hands alone. On paper, the family now owned only a small fraction of their own company's worth. In practice, they still controlled every vote that mattered. It was a piece of financial engineering nobody else in this series ever built. Not the Vanderbilts, not the Posts, not the Bushes. A structure that let the family give away the wealth without giving away the vote. For a decade, this arrangement stayed private, until 1956, when the family took the company public in what was then the largest stock offering in Wall Street's history. Here is the detail that makes the mechanism visible. When the shares hit the market, ordinary investors were buying the class that represented almost all of the economic value of the company and getting almost none of its voting power in return. The family shares, the ones with the votes attached, were never sold to the public at all. The foundation gradually sold off its enormous stake over the following decades to fund its charitable giving, spreading the economic ownership of the company across millions of strangers around the world. And through every single one of those sales, the family's grip on the actual vote never loosened by a single percentage point, because the 2 classes of stock were never allowed to mix. This is the firewall. Somewhere around 40% of the vote, permanently reserved for a class of shares the family alone was allowed to hold, no matter how small their economic slice of the company eventually became. So the family had solved fragmentation. They had solved the dilution trap that swallowed the Bushes whole. They had built a machine that could survive death, taxes, and a public stock offering without ever losing the one thing that mattered most, the vote. And yet, if you were watching this story from the outside in the decades that followed, you would have seen something strange happening anyway. The name stayed on the building, the family kept its seats in the boardroom, but the actual running of the company, the day-to-day decisions about what cars to build and how to build them, began sliding quietly into other hands. The grandson who inherited command in the late 1940s was a forceful, demanding executive who rebuilt the company's management with a wave of brilliant outside hires, professional managers, imported specifically because the family itself no longer had enough people who understood how to run an industrial giant this size. One of those outside hires would go on to help build one of the company's most beloved cars, then get publicly fired by the family patriarch decades later in a boardroom confrontation that made headlines around the country over nothing more than a personal falling out. The family still held the vote, but the company had become something the family did not, and increasingly could not, run alone. By the time the great-grandson inherited the chairmanship at the end of the 20th century, the pattern had fully hardened. The family's economic stake in the company they had founded had shrunk, decade after decade of stock offerings and share sales, down to somewhere around 2% of the total value of the business. Their vote still counted for roughly 40%, protected by the very structure their grandfather and great-grandfather had built. But 2% of the money and 40% of the vote is a strange kind of ownership. You control the outcome, you do not own most of the result. Which brings us back to that conference room in 2006. The company was losing market share to foreign competitors year after year, bleeding cash, and heading toward the same wall that would soon claim its two great Detroit rivals into a government bailout. The great-grandson chairman made a decision that no founder in this family's history had ever had to make. He stepped back from the chief executive's chair himself and brought in an outsider, a career aerospace executive with no history in the automobile business and no family connection at all, to run daily operations instead. And to fund the transformation without government help, the company mortgaged nearly every physical asset it owned: factories, patents, real estate, and the trademarked blue oval logo itself against that $23 billion loan. It was, in one sense, the ultimate proof that the firewall worked. The family still had the vote to make that decision. Nobody outside the family could overrule it. But look closely at what the decision actually was. The family that had spent a century engineering a structure to keep outsiders from ever running their company was now handing daily control of it to an outsider anyway, voluntarily, because it was the only way left to save it. The loan was repaid. The company survived the crisis that swallowed its rivals, the only one of the three not forced into a federal bailout. And today, the family's descendants still hold their board seats, still hold their 40% of the vote, and the company still carries their name on every hood that rolls off the line. But the chief executive today is not family, has not been family for decades. The engineers, the designers, the strategists who decide what the company actually builds are professionals with no bloodline connection to the founder at all. The family kept the one thing every other dynasty in this series lost: the vote. And in keeping it, they discovered something the others never had the chance to learn because they never made it this far. A vote is not the same as a company. A firewall protects the structure. It does not, on its own, run the machine inside it. That is the principle sitting underneath this entire story, and it cuts against everything the earlier chapters in this universe seem to teach. Fragmentation kills a fortune. Dilution kills control. Every family in this series lost because they let the vote scatter into strangers' hands. This family did the one thing none of the others managed. They built a wall around the vote and defended it for 5 generations, through death, through taxes, through the largest stock offering in Wall Street history, and the wall held every single time. And it still was not enough to keep the company itself, the actual daily machine, in the family's hands. Because control of a vote and command of an enterprise are not the same inheritance, and a family can win the one battle every other dynasty in this story lost, and still discover the war had a second front they never built a wall for at all. The empire was never just the vote. The vote was only ever the last wall standing, and behind that wall, quietly, for 70 years, almost everything else the family's name used to mean was already gone. Sit with that phrase for a second, because it is easy to hear it as a happy ending and move on. It is not one. A family that keeps the vote and loses the company has not escaped the pattern this series keeps returning to. It has simply found a slower, more dignified way to live inside it. The Vanderbilts lost everything in 3 generations because nobody built a wall. This family built the wall and watched the water rise on the other side of it anyway, one professional hire at a time, one outside executive at a time, until the wall was protecting an empty room. There is a version of this story where that sounds like failure. There is another version where it is the only real success in this entire universe of collapsed dynasties. Because unlike the Vanderbilts, unlike the Posts, unlike the Bushes, this family can still walk into a room once a year and cast a vote that matters. They can still say no. Nobody can force a sale over their objection, the way InBev forced one on a family that owned 4% of its own name. That is not nothing. In a series built entirely on families who lost the ability to say no, a family that kept it, even an empty symbolic version of it, is the exception worth studying. But here is the harder question underneath all of it, the one this family's own history refuses to answer cleanly. What is a vote worth if the thing you are voting on is no longer yours to understand? The great-grandson who mortgaged the name in 2006 still holds his seat today. He still votes. He has simply spent 2 decades learning to vote on decisions made by people who do not share his blood, in a language of supply chains and battery chemistry his own great-grandfather never had to speak. That may be the most honest inheritance any dynasty in this series ever received. Not a fortune, not a company, just a seat at the table, and the discipline to keep showing up to it long after the table stopped being entirely his.